Well, let's begin, everyone. First of all, thank you for joining. It's nice to see people here today, and I'm glad that everyone is interested to find out more about this training, where we're going to look at essentially why it's important to bring yoga philosophy into our classes, and just a little bit about how we can do that. So I'm going to do that using some slides today so that everyone can follow along. So I'm just going to share the slides that I'm going to be presenting. And it's worth mentioning that at the start, I've called this the heart of yoga, integrating philosophy in your classes. And the reason briefly for the title is the heart of yoga is actually the name of a book by Sri T. Krishnamacharya's son, T.K.V. Desikachar, and I highly recommend it for everyone who teaches, because it basically sets out the principles of yoga practice in very, very simple and easy to understand terms, but founded on a baseline or a substrate of yoga philosophy, specifically the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, which I'm going to be talking about a little bit more as we go through the session today. So as always, whenever I begin a session or a training, I always like to chant an invocation. And there's a couple of reasons for this. Number one, it's just a nice way to draw a line between what we've been talking about before and what we're going to do now. And two, also, it's part of honoring this particular invocation, Patanjali, who is the accredited with being the author or the compiler of the Yoga Sutras. It's honoring the tradition, honoring and offering gratitude for the fact that we are able to be here and to study in this way and to be together sharing this wisdom and this knowledge. So I just invite everyone for a moment to just sit still. If you're in a space where you can, to close your eyes. If you're in a space where you can, and I'm just going to chant this invocation to Patanjali, and then we'll dive into the topic for today. Yogena citasya padena vacham malam sharirasya cha vaidyakena yopakarotam pravaram muninam patanjalim pranjalirana tosmi abahu purushakaram shankachakra sitharinam sahasra shirasam shvetam pranamami patanjalim Srimate Anantaya Nagarajaya Namo Namaha. So let's continue from here. So I just wanted to give what we might call a modern context in which or an understanding of a modern context that we find ourselves in, which then helps us to understand the way that yoga is currently being transmitted or transmuted. And of course, these are all generalizations to make a point. So there will always be specific examples that may fall outside of this. But generally speaking, what we can say is that our culture, and as a result of that, our mental conditioning, is affecting the way in which yoga is transmitted today. What I mean to say by that is that we live in a world that I've mentioned here, which is hyper-growth focused economically, politically, and culturally. So this is what we call the modern era. We can call it capitalism, neo-capitalism, whatever. We can call it Western culture. But essentially, for good or for worse, we won't get into that today, the world has been imbibed with this culture, which basically seeks growth at all costs. And I'm talking about that also on a personal level. The pace of our lives has got faster. The pace of the world has got faster. The things that we seek to achieve in our lives, perhaps we go about them with more intensity than maybe people would have done a few hundred years ago for various reasons. And what we must be really clear about in this modern era is that actually nothing that we do or nothing that we practice actually sits outside of that cultural paradigm. That is to say that the tentacles of that philosophical setup that we have in the world today extends into the way that we look after ourselves, the way that we perhaps parent our children, and of course also the way that we practice yoga. So as I've said, yoga is not immune to these forces as it sits within this existing paradigm or culture. And as a result of that, what is happening is our modern postural yoga, the physical practice of yoga, what we could call asana, is increasingly becoming more of a form of physical exercise. It's increasingly influenced by this external political and economic situation and paradigm. As a result of that, modern yoga is very much focused on physical exertion and exercise. And perhaps in some cases, we have some philosophical platitudes or a few phrases here and there that are tacked on for good measure. I'm being a little bit cynical in order to be able to make a point. But the reality is that in most cases today, we find that yoga is being taught and is being practiced outside of a deep and rooted understanding of the origin of yoga and the wisdom, the thousands of years old wisdom from which yoga originally arose. And that's problematic for various reasons. And it's problematic because we need to first of all look at, well, why does this even matter? Why is it that we need to know that yoga today has changed from what it used to be, perhaps? And also, why is it important for us as teachers if we are going to share yoga in a way that is sensible and also in a way that is going to help our students over the long term? So I often use this example, which is that imagine that you are trying to go from point A to point B on a road trip or to walk somewhere, and you didn't have a map, whether it be Google Maps of today, whether it be the A to Z of 15 years ago, or whether it be following the North Star many, many years ago. If we don't have a map to know where we're going and how to practice, how do we ever get there? So as I'll come on to talk about, one of the most important things and one of the most grounding things about yoga philosophy is that it helps us to understand what is the purpose of yoga? Where are we supposed to be going? How do we practice in a way that is aligned with the destination that yoga speaks of? Not to have blind faith in the destination, but as yoga always says, on a scientific basis for us to practice, to see the results in our own lives, in our own experience, and as a result of that, maybe to gain more strength and faith to continue practicing in that way. So if we can't truly understand or assess whether what we are sharing or teaching will be of long-term benefit to ourselves or others, then that puts us in a difficult situation in terms of teaching people and helping to guide them towards the goal of yoga, which we'll talk about in a moment. Equally, and perhaps as important, if not more important, is the fact that unknowingly, if we are completely wrapped up in the culture of today, and I'll explain how we can maybe off-ramp from being completely conditioned by the modern culture today, how do we know that the practices that we are passing on to our students, which have become untethered from this ancient wisdom, how do we know if they're actually going to help people? So we can unknowingly start to take on the conditioning of the modern era, and through our teaching, which is going to happen to a certain degree anyway, but through our teaching, we can start to embed those cultural conditions through our teaching as well. So I think an important point to make here is this, which is that for anyone who's studied a little bit about modern postural yoga, we will know that actually for the last 400 or 500 years, there's been a very, very fast evolution of asana practice. So if you look back to, for example, the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, which is a text which is often linked to around the 1500s, in that text you have a very limited number of postures. But if you go back even further to the Yoga Sutras of 2,000 years ago, and the Bhagavad Gita maybe 3,000 years ago or longer, there's almost no mention of postures at all, or the postures are very much meditative postures. So the fact is that in recent times, practice has changed a lot. But what hasn't changed is the underlying wisdom of those practices. And this is the yoga philosophy. So in classical yoga, the yoga of Patanjali, the darshana, which is the way of seeing of yoga, which there are 6 in Indian culture. In that paradigm, the Yoga Sutras is the foundational text of yoga in classical yoga, according to Patanjali. And in that text, it tells us what is the goal of yoga? How do we get to that goal? It gives many, many different guidelines and practices and ways that we can see the world to help us on our journey. And as a result of that, it transcends the wisdom, in inverted commas, of today. In other words, what I've talked about, the cultural conditioning that we find ourselves in. So the wisdom is timeless, even if the physical practices, what we're practicing, have changed in recent times. So how do we help our students best over the long term is something that we really need to consider. If we're just offering them a class every week or however often they come to our session, and we're doing something nice for their body, nothing wrong with that. If we're doing something nice for their breath, nothing wrong with that. But if we don't understand the fundamental tenets of how yoga helps us to shift our mental patterning and our mental conditioning to a different place, and we don't understand how that takes place over the long term, then are we actually helping our students to transform and to find peace in their lives to the greatest extent possible? So that is the importance, and that is why it matters. So, a couple of points on why this is so important and how it can help us. So, number one, studying yoga philosophy allows us to understand the goal of yoga. It allows us to understand the goal of yoga. Very, very simply speaking, yoga, and forgive me if everyone already knows this, I'm sure you do, but it's sometimes useful to repeat these things and to experience them in a different setting in order to take something new from them. So fundamentally, again, according to Krishnamacharya, according to his students, his son, and many others who study with him for a long period of time, according to the interpretation of the Yoga Sutras, yoga is simply a movement towards stillness and a movement towards peace. And we use the various practices of yoga in order to take us in that direction. Now, just to be very clear here, and again to state the obvious for the sake of wanting to make a point, it doesn't say that the goal of yoga is to stand on one finger whilst holding your breath for 75 seconds and feeling really stressed while doing it. Right? But to make a silly point, it doesn't tell us that in order to reach the goal of yoga is to be able to hold down the dog for such a long time, you can get great snaps for your Instagram page. Again, slightly tongue-in-cheek. It tells us that the goal of yoga is to create a movement towards stillness and peace. And to remember, obviously I'm going beyond what it says here, that yoga is a holistic practice. That means it incorporates body, it incorporates breath, it incorporates energy, it incorporates mind and intelligence and spirit or awareness or consciousness or whatever word we want to use that we feel comfortable. And therefore, what we must realize is that the yoga practice that is sound, that is appropriate, that meets the goal of what the great sages have been talking about and writing about and passing on verbally through oral tradition for thousands of years, is a movement at every single one of those levels. Well, apart from consciousness, because consciousness is fundamentally at peace and stable. But all of those other levels are moving us towards stillness and peace. So therefore, even by looking at this, if we believe that yoga practice is a physical practice, and we don't expand our understanding of the koshas or the layers that lie beyond the Annamaya kosha, beyond the body, we're talking about breath and energy and so forth, then we're actually not guiding ourselves in a holistic way towards stillness and towards peace. And the reason that stillness and peace is so important is because that is what helps to liberate us from suffering. And remember that yoga is a movement from what is called dukkha, meaning suffering, to sukha, which means ease and comfort. So that's number one, movement towards stillness and peace. And studying yoga philosophy helps us to understand that much more fully. Number two, understanding yoga philosophy allows us to present and share sound practices. Now, the thing is that none of us, myself included, want to present anything that isn't sound. But the reality is that unless we have a stable source that we can learn from, that goes back to a time, again, that was not cultured in this current modern political, economic, socio paradigm, it means that we may be misinterpreting things through a modern lens, which means that we're missing out on channeling that ancient wisdom, which is profound and as relevant today as it ever was, perhaps even more relevant given the state of the world and the state of our lives more generally. So what I wanted to mention here briefly is that understanding yogic philosophy, yes, allows us to present and share sound practices that, see point one, move us in a direction and our students in a direction of peace and stillness. But here I'm saying more focus on internal how than external what. And just to give you an example here, typically speaking, in most 200-hour teacher training, let's say we're talking about Adho Mukha Svanasana, let's say we're talking about downward facing dog. We learn how to position the hand, we learn how to draw the arms and the shoulders away from the wrist, we learn how to maybe tilt the pelvis forward, to lift up through the tailbone and so on and so forth, maybe to tuck the chin. But what's rarely given as much guidance or cueing is what's going on internally. How are we breathing? How do we feel in the posture? And not only how do we feel, but after practice, what is the goal of really how we should be feeling? Again, read point one. If the goal of yoga is to move towards a state of shanti, of peace, and sthira, stability, then actually we want to, in that example, to be inculcating that bhava, that felt state, into our body. So in that way, the Adho Mukha Svanasana becomes a container in which at some point we let go of obsessively trying to perfect the physical form, and we start to begin and notice, what is my felt experience within the body? And by doing that gradually over time, as we'll talk about in the next point, I believe, that helps to create the shift psychologically into a new pattern, into a new way of being. So if you think about the number of cues physically for a posture like downward facing dog, of which there are so many that we can come up with, how many of us here, hand on heart, actually have a similar number of cues for the way that we breathe? Like, as an example, when you're breathing in, we just say inhale, exhale. But maybe if we're doing a pranayama practice or a guided breathwork practice, we start to actually talk to people about where exactly in their body they're breathing into. Is it the front of the ribs? Is it the back of the ribs? Is it the side of the body? Are we allowing the belly to move first? Are we allowing the chest to move first? What is the feeling of how we're breathing? What is the result of how we're feeling when we sit afterwards and we reflect and we notice? So again, this is what I'm calling the internal how we should be feeling, and moving into the subtleties of the practice and letting go of our over-attachment, if we're not careful, to the physicality of the practice. Because then if we're not careful, all we are going to do is to continue to bring what I'm going to call, for want of a better expression, the exercise mentality into our practice. And the thing is here, and I know that this is sometimes a bit controversial to say, but I'm going to say it anyway, not because I want to be, but because I think it's something that's worth reflecting on. Yoga is not exercise, okay? If we want to use yoga techniques to exercise, that's fine. And it's not to say that a side benefit of practicing yoga is not that it helps to strengthen and heal our body in different ways. Of course, those things are all part and parcel of practicing. But if our actual goal is peace and stillness, then we have to let go of the idea of yoga as exercise. We have to go deeper beyond the body to unlock those deeper and more profound layers. Number 3, understanding yoga philosophy allows us to impact students' lives in a more profound manner. But the thing is that, again, if we align in the modern world, those of us that are yoga teachers, we want to be able to share sound practices. We want to be able to benefit our students' lives. And also, let's be honest, we also want to earn a living from what we're doing. And the reality is that if we know and understand a long-term path of transformation that's going to help our students, it's going to tick all of those boxes. It's going to allow us to be able to pass on something sound and to sleep well at night as a result of it. It's going to allow our students to be placed on a long-term path that they can practice over time knowing that ultimately they are moving towards this more peaceful state. And three, as a result of having a long-term pathway for people, we hopefully will ensure that people keep coming to our classes. And as a result of that, we also can develop our ability to continue teaching. Now, what I've said here is that we impact students' lives in a profound manner because we help them to overcome their existing what are called samskaras. Again, I'm sure many of you know this word. A samskara is basically an underlying impression in the mind that is created as a result of something arising in the present moment. So when an event happens, two things arise. There's a memory created, a smriti, and at the same time, there's a samskara, which is underlying groove, we might call, in our mind. And the more that those grooves build up, the more they control our present moment. We act according to autopilot from all of our previous experiences. So we have in students a bunch of people turning up with a bunch of samskaras. And generally, when we find people coming to us in classes, they are coming in the same way that when I go to my teacher, I'm coming with my problems and my samskaras and my patterns, which are causing pain and suffering in my life. And again, the reason that it's so important for us to have an understanding of yoga philosophy is that without understanding the ancient wisdom, unknowingly we might help to continue to exacerbate and solidify the existing patterns that they're bringing to us, rather than helping to subdue those patterns and replace them with what are called sat samskaras, which are more beneficial samskaras. So we reduce the existing samskaras and kleshas and affliction, and we start to bring in better patterns and better samskaras that help to move them in the right direction. So a classic example of this, again, using the body, is this idea of finding our edge in classes. And again, I'm not saying this is right or wrong. This is for everyone to reflect. This is just what's helped me on my journey and what I've learned through this Krishnamacharya tradition. Finding the edge physically means finding the place where you're almost about to lose your balance and you're pushing physically to a point where you're just at the point where it starts to move into discomfort. And the thing is that if we come from a background in a society that constantly encourages us to do and to move and to intensify and to strive and to hold and to grasp, all of those patterns, not so subtly, end up in our bodies, in our mindset, and in the way we do things. I remember one of my first yoga teachers, when I was still really, really hooked into the corporate world and pushing and striving, saying something in class which I completely misunderstood at the time, which was that who you are on the mat is what you are in life. And I interpreted that to mean, well, I need to be strong and intense and pushing in life, so I need to be strong and intense and pushing on the mat. And actually, having then practiced for a number of years, I realized I got that completely wrong, because what I'd not understood is the potential for yoga to transform us on the mat, and for that then to become the model that we look to bring into the rest of our lives. So none of this we will understand or know. None of this will be able to benefit our students if we don't spend time studying it ourselves, imbibing it ourselves, practicing it ourselves, and then being able to take it out into the world in a way that is safe, in a way that allows people to benefit from this ancient. So I wanted to use an example to just get into something a bit more specific. So the example I wanted to use here is from Yoga Sutras, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, from chapter 2, Sadhana Pada, Sutra 46. I'm sure many of you will know this sutra. Sthira Sukham Asana. Basically what that is saying, according to the Krishnamacharya interpretation, is that when we practice asana, we want the asana to have the qualities in equal measure of sthira, which is stability, and sukham, which is comfort and ease. Now, this goes back to the internal how, not the external what. And what I've done here is I've just broken it down. You can see here is body, and here is breath, and here is mind. Well, certainly my mind, that's for sure. And if we go up to body, things that we can ask ourselves as teachers, things that we can ask our students, well, how do you hold your body during practice? And what we can do in a class that is themed around this particular sutra is we can cue more for stability and ease, rather than cueing to just find the physical posture and the 90-degree angle between torso and thighs in downward dog, for example. How does your body feel as you let go into this posture? Can you find sukha? Can you find some ease by reducing intensity? Can you find stability in a way that is blanketed or held in an ocean of ease? Can you let go of intensity? These are just some examples. Does it contain the above qualities? We can guide students to cultivate these qualities and to notice them within. This is just at the body level. Similarly, at the breath level, which again, we may often just be inhale, exhale, we can start to say things like, does your breath mirror these qualities of sthira and sukha? We can ask students to seek out and soften tension in the breath, meaning, can they bring their attention to their breath as they're in a posture? Can they notice whether the way that they're breathing in this moment of time is causing more tension or less tension? And while still keeping the breath long, or as long as it's comfortably possible, can we let go of tension in the breath? Can we guide, for example, a feeling of stability by offering students a rhythm of breathing that works for them? So, for example, maybe counting for them 4, 2, 4, 2, 4 second inhale, 2 second pause, 4 second exhale, 2 second pause, or finding a rhythm that works for them. Because again, a rhythmical breath is a stable breath. So I'm just showing how from one sutra, we can start to theme a class by drawing it into the body, drawing the theme into the breath, and then finally at the bottom, drawing it into the mind. So what does it mean to have a steady and comfortable mind? We can cue students to relax their minds, ease, to find space, to let go of the distraction. We can cue students to bring focus and stability to what they're doing by bringing our attention or their attention to a drishti or an inner gaze point that again fits in with the theme of the class. And how is this reflected in our practice? Well, we know that the mind is steady and at ease when we are noticing that we are more present with what we're doing in each and every moment. So again, very, very short example of how with one sutra, we can theme, let's say, a month worth of classes, starting with the body, moving to the breath, moving to the mind, and then gradually integrating those things. And what this shows us fundamentally is to deepen the posture doesn't mean to make the posture more complex or more intense. To deepen the asana, it means to actually bring the holistic levels of body, breath, and mind into the mix and treat them with equal weighting and equal importance. Well, actually, that's not even true, because mind fundamentally is the most important thing that we are trying to affect in our practice. What else can we do? Other tools and techniques. And again, this is all based on the idea of how do we bring from, let's say, one sutra or one philosophical concept, how do we bring that in a coherent way into a class or into a series of classes? So other things that we can do. So the first one I've mentioned here is mantra. So again, even if you're not confident of knowing many, many mantras, even if you're not confident of knowing the meanings of all of these things, even if you haven't practiced them with a teacher yet, even just using Om, for example, when I say even, I mean Om is the root, it's the most powerful mantra really that there is. But even just using Om, we can adapt to many, many different themes. Just a couple of examples. So if stability is your focus, remember that we talked earlier about rhythm of breath being something that's really important. So we can guide people in a rhythmical chanting practice, and we can cue the stability of the rhythm as being the thing that we focus on in the mantra. So rather than the volume, rather than pronunciation necessarily, can we just find a Om, 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 or whatever it might be that allows them to, and allows you as a teacher to pique their interest in finding stability through rhythm. Similarly, if we're focused more on the sukham side, more on the ease, maybe we notice, and I'm sure many of you notice this, when we chant in class, there'll be some students that really belt out the Oms. And there's nothing wrong with that, but what you can then do after you've noticed the volume in the room is you can say, okay, next time, let's just try and bring it down a bit. So then you start to focus people. How do you chant easily? How do your vocal cords reverberate in a way that's more easy and kind and gentle? So these are just different mechanisms that we can use to fit the same mantra into, for example, a different type of practice. Again, if it's a morning practice, we might encourage a more energizing one that's slightly louder. If it's an evening practice, we might choose to bring the volume down and make it softer, all the way down to whispering, all the way down to manasika, mental repetition. Number 2 on this list is svadhyaya, which is often referred to as self-study or reflection. Again, in a class, in shavasana, we can ask people to reflect, for example, well, as you lie here, just gently reflect on your life at the moment and gently see how you might be able to bring steer or stability or ease into the rest of your day. Just reflect on that. So again, just guiding students at different stages in the practice to just think and reflect on how they can bring the philosophy that's being taught in the class, not just in their practice on the mat, but into their day-to-day lives. And then finally, well, it's not finally, but just for the purposes of today, affirmations and or self-touch, which is known as nyasa. So nyasa is typically, you'll recognize the word from vinyasa. Vinyasa means special placement. This is just nyasa, placement of hand on the body at the different chakras maybe, or different important parts of the body, in terms of being able to bring phrases into our body. So for example, if we were doing a practice on stability and ease, may I find stability in my body, and place your hand on your heart space. May I find ease in my breath, maybe place your hand on your belly. And so again, we can offer affirmations that we can work out in relation to the theme, in relation to the sutra, and then we can use self-touch in this way in the form of nyasa in order to bring ourselves more deeply and our students more deeply into the practice. So I guess the point that I'm making is that we have an innumerable number of tools that we use in every class. But the idea of theming a class according to a yoga philosophy, paradigm, or concept or presentation is to really think, okay, how do I draw through this particular piece of wisdom into each and everything that I'm going to teach today? So generally speaking, in a physical yoga class, we're going to move from body to breath to mind. And so again, as you're structuring the class, you can think, okay, right, well, how do I make this relevant for body? How do I make this relevant for breath? How do I make this a mind practice as well? Because remember, the fundamental goal of yoga is transformation of the mind. It's the cessation of the vrittis, the activities of the mind, to find nirodha, to find stillness of the mind, one-pointed ekagrata or focus. And so the theme really needs to apply to the entire class, because if you're trying to guide people towards this goal, then it needs to be thematically coherent, is what I've called it. So thematic coherence is basically the idea that what you're doing in your resting period in some way relates to what you've done in pranayama or breathing, in some way relates to asana and the way you've had people move. And also one thing that I find quite useful, particularly in classes where lots of people come back every week. So you have a great group of people that are dedicated to practice and you see them every week. So 80, 90% of your class are the same people. You can build this over a series over the month. So it means then you don't have to every single week find a new practice or find a new sequence to keep people interested. You can actually deepen the practice perhaps with the same series of asanas, but just gradually, subtly bring in the breath, bring in the mind practices, bring in the mantra, bring in the nyasa, and so forth. So I always like to call this the good news and the bad news. It's not really bad news, again, tongue in cheek. Number one, as we start to wrap up, understanding and practicing yoga philosophy will experientially improve the lives of our students. There's just no doubt about that. But if we have an understanding of it and we really truly understand the way that yoga works as a system to help to create long-term samskaric change in our students, then bringing that to the table in classes is undoubtedly going to help to improve their lives. The bad news, and it's not bad news because as yoga teachers, we all are passionate about yoga and want to know more. To share it in a sound way, we need to dedicate time to study, and I put in brackets with a competent teacher, and I'll come back to that just for a moment, and practice it in our own life. So the bad news, in inverted commas, we need to dedicate time, we need to practice it, because we can only really teach other people when it becomes a lived experience. It's not that we just read a book and then we've read it and then we just start talking to people about it. We need to imbibe it. We need to let it filter in and marinate into our lives. We then need to learn from it and then bring whatever wisdom or insight or prajna we had from that into our teaching and into our sharing. I say a competent teacher. These are the words of Krishnamacharya. We want to make sure that the person that we are going to, that is our teacher, we at least believe has a reasonably good understanding of these concepts. And to a certain degree or to a greater degree, practicing them in their own lives. And we feel that they are sincere and dedicated to the path as well. Then number three, it provides us with a framework, and I think this is particularly relevant in the modern era. It provides us with a framework to assess all yoga practices from whatever teacher we find, from whatever methodology, from whatever lineage, and whether those practices are actually taking us towards the highest goal. So it means we can look at Ashtanga yoga in the context of competent philosophy. We can look at Kundalini, we can look at Vinyasa, whatever it is, and we can say, okay, now that I understand the goal of yoga, how does this fit in? And does this still make sense to me? Is this still coherent as a framework that allows people to move from dukkha to sukha? So I've sort of run through that as well, relatively quickly, because we've only had a short amount of time this morning. Before I finish and before we take questions, I'd just like to say a couple more things. When I went to India to start studying at the Krishnamacharya Yoga Mandir, I'd already done my 200 hours. I'd already been teaching for a couple of years, so not very long at all. And I'd been reading about yoga philosophy. I had the books. But when I went into my first yoga philosophy class, I sat there and my mouth, my jaw just opened. And I literally felt like, how can I describe this? A feeling that I'd come home, a feeling that I arrived at this place of wisdom, not my own wisdom, but this wisdom that was being expounded by the teacher, that fundamentally spoke to how I could change my life, how I could transform the way I felt in my life. I don't necessarily mean the external, but moving from stress and anxiety to peace and stability, for example. And each day when I went back to the class, not only did I look forward to it so much, but I just absolutely dove in and I just felt everything making so much sense. At night, I'd make notes, I'd read, and really ever since then, by my bed are a stack of books on yoga philosophy. I have regular connection to my teacher in India, mentoring and classes and so forth. And I've continued to study. This is a lifelong practice to understand the depth of this wisdom. To some of us, I'm sure that can feel quite daunting, and that can feel maybe overwhelming that there's so much to learn. But again, based on our theme today, sthira and sukha, just be stable in what you practice and stable in what you study. And the sukha is having the ease to know we're never going to know it. We don't need to know it, but we just need to have practiced and understood enough to be able to guide ourselves and guide other people just a little bit. So for me, it came from this deep, deep passion and a feeling that once I got my teeth into the Yoga Sutras or the Bhagavad Gita, that now these texts fundamentally guide the way that I live. They guide the way that I parent my daughter. They guide the way that I live in my partnership with my wife. They guide the way that I try to teach. They guide the way that I try to interact with the outside world. I don't get it right a lot of the time, of course, certainly not perfect, but they've become the underpinning structures of the way that I view the world and the way that I try to be in the world. And I say that because, to finish, this is what we can offer to our students as well. We can offer them the platform to empower them so they don't need to keep coming back to the teacher out of dependency, that they then begin to imbibe these practices and live them and hold them in their heart and basically end up living like that in their own lives and to benefit their lives and others. So I think the video's just gone off. So I think really quite good timing there. I'm back now on the video, but I think that was really what I wanted to say today. I hope that everyone has found that useful in some way. Again, I've tried to condense what is a huge topic into a few slides and into maybe 30 or 40 minutes.